Hello, AITE. Today it's pretty chilly this morning, so I'm wearing my jacket indoors. But today we're going to start talking about the Age of Exploration's results. And what was happening at the same time was the results of the scientific revolution, which is pretty important. So you're probably taking a test today, and this is why I'm showing you this video. Hopefully it helps you, and you still learn stuff. So one big result of the Age of Exploration is the Columbian Exchange. Maybe you've heard of this before. This is the transfer of crops, diseases, people, and other goods and skills that people had from the old world to the new, and then vice versa. So the most disruptive thing that got transferred was the diseases. So smallpox, we learned in class, was particularly destructive and it wiped out maybe 90% of the populations of the new world that it reached. It didn't reach everybody quite immediately. And the rest of these diseases also played a role as well. And fortunately, we don't really have to worry about any of them today, except some people still get influenza and malaria throughout the world, and sometimes measles, depending, I guess, what country you're in. But you never hear people getting smallpox anymore, so that's really good. And these diseases actually came from the livestock, so that's pretty important to understand. These diseases existed in this part of the world because these people had livestock. So if you live in close quarters with your cattle, your sheep, your pigs, your horses, you get some of the diseases from them. And that happened over thousands of years in the old world, and that's why these people had different immune systems. And they also had these grains that were really easy to grow, like wheat, rice, barley, and oats. And that's why some civilizations, like in Mesopotamia, developed so early, and in parts of China developed so early, because of the crops they had and the livestock that they had. Whereas in the New World, they didn't really have much livestock, at least like this. They had llamas in the Andes Mountains, but they didn't keep them the same way, so they didn't really get diseases from them over there. And there's some other large animals in North America, like buffalo, but you can't really domesticate buffalo in quite the same way that you can everything else. And there might have just been a difference in how Native Americans treated animals as compared to Europeans. Maybe they saw it differently. So anyway, a lot of stuff came to Europe as well. An example I like to point out is pepper, or the pepper rather. So hot peppers, everybody thinks that China always had hot peppers. And if you go to a Chinese restaurant, they like to use hot peppers in their cooking, or a Thai restaurant, right? But peppers actually came from the New World, and then Spanish traders traded the peppers to other people in the Middle East, and then the peppers eventually made their way to Asia, um, probably by the 1600s. So the pepper was not always found throughout the world, and that's a cool little fact. Another crop I like to point out is the potato. When the potato was introduced to France, their population got a couple centimeters taller on average because they were so malnourished. And once they got the potato in their diet, they started growing more. Pretty funny. Okay, so now we're going to start talking about the colonies that some of these countries created as a result of this. So first, let's look at Spain. Spain is shown by this kind of pukey looking color over here. You can see they took a lot of colonies, a lot of land throughout the coast of South America, Central America, and the southwestern and southern United States, as well as the Caribbean. Spain was really in charge of this whole operation from the 1500s to the early 1600s. And Portugal was their biggest competitor, and they're shown by this brownish looking color here, or maybe tan. And this is the earliest areas that became the colony of Brazil over here in South America. And then they also took some colonies along the coast of Africa, the Persian Gulf, and India, Indonesia, and other areas throughout Southeast Asia. And the Spanish also took a colony in the Philippines. And they used that colony in the Philippines here to form a cross-Pacific trade route. So they had a trade route going from Mexico over here to the Philippines across the Pacific Ocean by the late 1500s. And that's one of the ways that a lot of these New World crops ended up reaching the Old World. A good example of this is eventually the sweet potato reached Papua New Guinea, and that became one of their main foodstuffs in Papua New Guinea. And before that, they didn't grow sweet potatoes. And Papua New Guinea is one of the few places in the world that still has lots of indigenous populations that are pretty much untouched by Western society. That's partially because the geography of Papua New Guinea is so hard to navigate that people haven't really explored there or taken over that easily. And also because they just kind of go around chopping foreigners' heads off. And that's, I guess, a good policy for them to keep people away. So that is another example, the sweet potato in Papua New Guinea. And then the English also started kind of reaching out their tendrils over here across the Atlantic. They started reaching out, and so did France, towards the areas that today are Canada. Those are the first areas that they reached. But still, England and France in the 1500s and the 1600s, they still weren't doing that much. They were just getting started compared to the Spanish. And then once England and France really became big forces in North America, Spain was on its way out. Spain was the dying man of Europe. It was a rotting empire. It was just kind of decaying, and it kept decaying until the Spanish-American War. And you're going to get to that in your 11th grade history class when you take American history. But their empire had a very long, slow decline, Spain. Okay, so this is a graphic that shows how the slave trade was broken down. So we see that Portugal sent the most slaves to Brazil. They're in the top tier here with about 35%. The Spanish Empire sent the second most. And you go look at all the land that they had, you can see why they sent so many slaves. And remember, the Native Americans were originally they were originally used for labor, or at least the Spanish and Portuguese tried to use them for labor, but it didn't work so well because they got diseases or they escaped, fought back. And they also weren't familiar with the farming techniques, and they just couldn't keep up with the work in a lot of cases. But people from Africa were already farmers in lots of cases, and they were already immune to lots of the diseases that Europeans had. And the slave trade was already in place in Africa due to the Muslim slave trade that already existed. So the Europeans just went in and they took it to another level. They increased the number of slaves that were demanded dramatically once they came in. And then we have the British came in, and the French, and they started doing their thing. And then once we reach this point here in the middle, this is really getting later on. Really in the late 1600s, early 1700s, that's what this is really referring to here. And some slaves also went to Europe as well. About 200,000 slaves went to Europe and built stuff there. If you look at the canals of Amsterdam, you can look those up on Google. Guess who built the canals of Amsterdam? Well, yeah, slaves. Guess who built the docks in New York City in Europe where all the ships land? Slaves. So even in these places today that are known for I guess being kind of progressive, like if you think of New York, you know that it's in the North, right? And the North was against slavery in the Civil War, but New York City had a lot of slaves. There's always exceptions to that rule, I guess. Okay, so the big picture here is that the Age of Exploration had some of the worst genocides in human history. So when we say genocide, we mean the destruction of an entire ethnic group or cultural or linguistic, language-based group of people. So the Native Americans and the Africans in areas affected by the slave trade. So the Native Americans, remember, were wiped out by disease mostly and brutality and being forced off their land. And African people were affected mainly by the slave trade and just by the harsh practices that were forced into effect by it. Millions of Africans died because of the slave trade. And people aren't sure about the exact numbers because a lot of that stuff didn't get written down. So starting from when they were abducted in Africa, including the voyage across the Atlantic, and then how they were treated in the Americas, there was a lot of people dying there too. That constitutes a genocide. And Spain and Portugal became very, very wealthy early on. And Portugal took parts of India, like I said before. Spain took the Philippines. So they were also in Asia. They had some places in Africa for trading. They had these forts, usually right on the water in all these places. But Spain, like I said, was on its way out in the mid-1600s, once France and England started competing with them. And all the other European countries realized that they could do the same thing. So these places, France, England, and the Netherlands, remember the Netherlands are where Dutch people are from, that's north of Germany, they would try to do the same thing. And they also became very wealthy as a result. But at the same time, they were having lots of their own wars in Europe and killing each other, so they didn't stay wealthy for that long. And eventually, some of the colonies that were built during this time eventually experienced revolutions. And that's really what we're trying to get to here. We're trying to get to the Enlightenment and the Age of Revolutions. That's our first real large unit. This is still just setting everything up at this point. So I do hope that most people heard some of this stuff before. But the Age of Revolutions is our next big step after we do the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment's going to take about 3 weeks, I think. And that's a less depressing topic, I think. I think the Enlightenment has a lot of positive messages that you're going to hear, and less stuff about genocide. So that would be a nice break from this. So anyway, so as these places were getting wealthy, like Spain and Portugal, other places were getting wealthy too. One of them was Italy, or specifically some of the Italian city-states, because Italy wasn't unified yet. But anyway, when people have more wealth, they usually could pay for better art and music and stuff like that, and they have more time and money to invent things. So this is an example of a Byzantine mosaic from the 500s AD. I don't know the exact year, but you can see the huge difference between this and this early Renaissance art, which came out in the 1400s, and that's Antonello da Messina. I think this was painted in the 1460s, and these are both images of Jesus, a historical figure. So the Renaissance was happening at the same time as the Age of Exploration. Were they connected? Maybe indirectly. But Italy, or the Italian city-states and republics, rather, were not reaching out to the New World. They were kind of just doing their own thing in the Mediterranean Sea, and they were trading a lot with the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman Empire was this huge Muslim empire that was based in Turkey. Turkey would be way off the map to the right here. You can't even really see it here. But anyway, they got pretty rich from this trade, and by trading with other people throughout the Mediterranean. They traded with people in North Africa as well. So remember, Italy was not like a unified Italy like it is today. It was a very complicated system of these city-states and republics. And lots of Europe was like this at this time too. And it was very complicated, just like if you follow Italian politics today, and it's also very complicated. But because of this wealth, people could pay for better art. So think of stuff like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci and people like that. That's when all that really good art was coming out, because people in places like Venice over here and Genoa over here got super wealthy from the slave trade. And you can look at their locations here, the cities. They're right on the water, and they're really easy to sail into. So everybody in these cities was pretty much either a merchant, a sailor, or a church official. And people started taking an interest in improving their lives here on earth, not in heaven. This is a really big deal. It's called humanism. And humanism is widely considered to be the root of the scientific revolution and therefore the Enlightenment, which is where we're going with all this. So humanism is just taking interest in the world around you and trying to improve your life now. Because remember, before this time, people were super religious, and their main goal was to improve their soul so they could get into heaven. So even if you get sick or something, a lot of people's mentality was that, well, God wills it for me to get sick, so I'm just going to pray and hope for the best, right? And people get sick, and then they would die of something like the influenza before they're 30. And, your whole family would be around your deathbed, and they would say, oh, it's God's will, let's pray for them, right? But here, people started actually trying to solve these problems and cure illnesses and improve their lives today for here and now. And this also, like I said, led to the scientific revolution. You had people like Galileo starting to appear shortly after the Renaissance, and Giordano Bruno, and we're going to talk about that too next time. So one thing you should know is that the Renaissance did not dramatically change the lives of regular people. Most people didn't realize they were even living in the Renaissance. It wasn't called the Renaissance until much later. There's just this explosion of art and culture that led to the scientific revolution. That's what I really want you to get from the Renaissance. And that's it. So I hope that you learned something from that, and if there's any way I can make these better, please tell me. Thank you, and have a good day.